I'm so glad that you're all here today. This is kicking off our inaugural Brown Bag Lecture, so we're very, very happy to have everybody here. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, President and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. Welcome to the building. Can I just see by show of hand who's a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society? So if you're not, you should join up. We have things by the door. It's only through our support and our membership that we're able to put on these programs, so I always like to encourage people to join if they can. Just a few announcements before I introduce our speaker. The first is to let you know some of the things that we have coming up. On April 11th, we have another genealogical workshop about using historical newspapers. And to go with that, the following day, also at noon, we have on April 12th, news stories that are no longer in the news, and our speakers will be Georgiana Vines and John North. Noah, what's his name? North. Yeah, John North. That's what I thought. And also, just to mention, so I don't know if you're aware, this is Women's History Month. It's one of the reasons we have our distinguished speaker in today. But also, we have a new website, a new resource that I'd like to tell everyone about. We're launching. It's called Votes for Women Online. It's our online exhibit. Here's a sticker. We have these by the door, and it celebrates the story of Tennessee and the role of the 19th Amendment. You can go to our website, which is easttnhistory.org, and then find the link to the new online exhibit that looks at women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment. Or you can go to womansuffrage.easttnhistory.org, which is its separate website. So I'd like to encourage everyone to do that. And also, before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors for this event, the Albers Family Foundation. We would like to thank them for helping put on the Brown Bag events, and they have been doing that for some time, and we're very happy that continues. Now, our speaker, and we're very, very, very happy to have her today, is Kami Ahrens. And she is from the Foxfire. She's the head of the Foxfire Museum. She joined there in 2017 and is responsible for curating its artifacts and coming up with its programs. Sorry, the text in my notes is very small. As well as managing the programs and etc. She hosts and also produces the podcast, which I'd like to encourage everyone to listen to. It's called It Still Lives. And she serves as the executive editor for the Foxfire magazine as well. She oversees the organization's Hallmark Leadership Program as well for local high school students. And though she is originally from the St. Louis area, she attended Nebraska-Lincoln for her graduate studies before she went to Georgia to the Foxfire organization. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here today in this beautiful city. We've got a great spring day here, so I'm excited you all took the time to join me to celebrate Women's History Month. A special thank you to everybody here at the East Tennessee Historical Society for bringing me out today. So as he mentioned, I am from the Foxfire Museum. Is anybody familiar with Foxfire? Okay, great. That's wonderful. Has anybody been to the museum? Awesome. Great. Okay, so a couple of people. That's wonderful. So Foxfire, for those of you who already know, just a refresher, we are an outgrowth of a student education program that has become a museum and a publishing arm. So we have a lot of moving pieces, and I always say there's no good, no good elevator pitch for Foxfire. We're in Mountain City, and we had a conversation earlier about where Mountain City was, so I'm just going to pull up this map really quick for frame of reference. So here's Knoxville. We're down here. We're in the northeasternmost corner of Georgia. So it's a nice day drive, and definitely makes for a good place to spend a weekend. So as I mentioned, we are a museum. We have over 20 historic log structures. They are set up as exhibits in artist studio spaces for people to encounter and understand Southern Appalachian history and culture. So we have different exhibits like this one pictured on woodworking. We do have a resident fiber artist and a resident weaver. They work together in a shared space to show visitors to the museum about how traditional crafts are continued into the present. And then we have lots of programming that goes alongside those elements of the museum. Again, just to get people engaged in understanding what Southern Appalachian culture was and what it is and how it's changing. So it started way back, as I mentioned, as an educational program. And I'll kind of explain the journey to the museum and what we are today. So in 1966, a group of high school students at Raven Gap Nacoochee School were misbehaving in their English class. They were doing all the things kids are not supposed to do, like lighting your teacher's trash can on fire. And so he, in aggravation, turned back to the students and said, "What is going to help you learn? How can I get you interested?" And they, as a group, decided they wanted to write a magazine. Well, in the 1960s, we can't just jump on Google or pull up our word processor on our computer. And the students had to go out and research how to actually make a magazine using scissors and glue and analog photography and typewriters. And as they were doing this, they were thinking about what they wanted to put into the magazine. And they knew they wanted some poetry, maybe some prose, some art pieces, but they also wanted local stories. And they went out and started talking to older people in their community about childhood stories, stories about place, folk tales. And these people they were talking to in the 1960s had been born in the 1870s, 1880s, and many of them were still living in a way that was reminiscent of an earlier century. So many of them were still living in the log homes that their great-great-grandparents had built. Most of them still raised all of their food. Very few of them had running water or electricity. Most of them still cooked over wood stoves. And they were carrying on these traditional crafts that were quickly dying out as this population aged out. And so the students began to interview these people for their magazine, and they started taking tape recorders, and it just gained in popularity, and they kept collecting these interviews because every time they went on an interview, they realized how much more there was to learn. So those interviews became the foundation of what is now our archive. And it started this program of going out into communities and collecting stories and getting students engaged in hands-on experiences, which in the 60s, this was pretty radical for the classroom. So the program grew over the years, and in 1972, the students were offered a book deal by what's now Penguin Random House. And that very first Foxfire book, which maybe most of you can recognize, the tan cover, that book has now sold over 9 million copies worldwide. And in 1972, when it was released, it provided the students with enough funds to reinvest in their community. So with royalties in hand, they decided that they wanted to buy a piece of property and create a learning center for themselves, future students, and their community. So they bought 100 acres of property, mountainside property. It was an old orchard that they converted to what's now the museum space. And so they went around their community, identified dilapidated structures that were historic. They took them apart and reassembled them log by log. I think I have some pictures. No, I don't. I apologize. Log by log at the museum space. And so that's what becomes the exhibits. And that's where we have our archive, and those are the spaces where our artists work. And so that's what's grown into the museum over the past 50 plus years. We do still continue our work with students. I'm proud to say every year we have local high school students come together. They actually get to use a card catalog and go through an archive, so it's not all digital. And we make sure that they're still getting out and talking to people in their community, that they're collecting stories about Appalachian traditions, but also what people are doing now, because our culture is not stagnant. Our culture is changing. And so I'm really proud to be a part of helping those students go into their community and not just produce the magazine, but get meaningful experiences that will help shape their futures and help them build skills to be successful after high school. So in addition to the student program and just a regular operating museum, we do have a lot of special programming so that the public can also get engaged and educated on Southern Appalachian history. So we offer a lot of classes for heritage skills, as well as activities, events with demonstrators and other things like that. So just looking at unique ways to make sure that people are having authentic experiences and coming together, most importantly, as a community. So where does this book fit with all of this that I've just told you? So this project I started about 4 years ago when I was pretty new at Foxfire still. And this book specifically is a collection of women's stories from the Foxfire archives. So we have over 20 publications through Foxfire. We have 12 books in our numbered anthology, Foxfire 1 through 12. And then we have what are called companion books, which are the Foxfire Book of Toys and Games, the cookbook. But we don't have a lot of books that look at just people's stories as a collection. So if you open a Foxfire book, you'll find what we call personality articles. So you might find a chapter or two about somebody, and it'll tell their whole life story in like 20 pages. But then you turn to the next chapter, and it might be a how-to article on how to make, head cheese, house meat, something like that, or cook over a wood stove, or maybe build a log cabin. So all kinds of different crafts and skills in the books. And when I was just getting familiar with Foxfire and going through our publications, I kept encountering these stories that just stopped me in my tracks. And they were stories from women that covered a lot of themes. They covered a lot of different topics. And I really felt the need for them to be pulled together in a shared narrative so that we could more closely examine what women's experiences in Appalachia were and are like, and what those diverse experiences can tell us about what exactly Appalachian identity is. A lot of people will often stereotype Appalachia, and they look at one definition, especially of Appalachian women. You might conjure up an image from the Depression where you see a poor white woman without shoes on or something like that. And that's the image that people get, is like this tough, poor white woman. And that's not what Appalachia has historically been, and it's not what Appalachia is now. So we wanted to really closely look at these women's stories and to pull them together and look at stories of place, stories of community, and to create a broader definition of what women's experiences in this region are like. So with that idea in mind and the support of our publisher, I turned to our archives, which is obviously the natural place to start any research project. And as I mentioned, we've been collecting since 1966, so we have almost 2,700 oral histories in our archival collection. So we have a lot, and that's not necessarily 2,700 individuals. A lot of people were revisited multiple times for interviews, but that's a lot of content to still go through. And so I wanted to look at women throughout the decades and try to arrange the book based on date of interview. So maybe pull some people from the 60s, some people from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s. And so looking at long-range change over time. And then also to cover diverse experiences, a diversity of topics, make sure that every person who was represented in the book was bringing something different to the table. So it was a big challenge just to narrow it down. I think I started with a list of like 50 or 60, and I had to get it down to 20. And I actually ended up with 21 because I couldn't make a decision. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the women that are in the book, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions and discussion at the end. So if there's anything that you see up here on the screen that you want to chat about, just let me know. I'll let y'all read some of these quotes on your own, but then I'll talk a little bit about the women that are featured. So the very first woman that I could find that had a recorded interview in the Foxfire archives was Margaret Norton. And Margaret is probably the closest to what you might think of as a typical mountain woman. So it was an interesting starting point to start with what people know about Appalachia and then to take it from there. So Margaret was really involved with Foxfire when they first started. She did share a lot of her information through interviews, but she also was directly involved in the magazine production, which is what makes Margaret a little bit more special in the early years. She actually ran a recipe column in the Foxfire magazine for a couple of years, and so she herself was also going out to her community and collecting things from her community. But Margaret is deeply connected to the land, and so she immediately sets us up to learn about the landscape. She lived in a region called Betty's Creek. A lot of the areas in Raven County are identified by their smaller communities, and most of those are based on the water system that they're next to. So you'll hear Kelly's Creek, Betty's Creek, War Woman is named after a creek. So Margaret lived on one part of Betty's Creek, and when she married, she moved up the road to another part of Betty's Creek, and that's where she lived her whole life. And she talks a lot in the 60s about how sad she is to see people selling off the land. And so the 60s are really when Raven County starts to boom in terms of development. Without going into too much background, we are right along the 441 corridor, which is a straight shot from Atlanta to the mountains. And in the 30s and 40s, a lot of regions of the mountains were turned into lakes for power to power Atlanta. And so along those lakes, Georgia Power started advertising that land as a spot for luxury homes. And so we start seeing people coming up from big cities in Florida and purchasing, or rather leasing, actually, it's a long-term land lease, the land around the lakes and building what are today multi-million-dollar homes. And this is all happening right around the time that the students are starting to interview people. And so Margaret is seeing this happen on the lakes, and she's starting to see it happen in her own closed little community of Betty's Creek. And so she's commenting on this progress and this development, and she talks about the value of land to her and to her people and her family. And she couldn't understand why somebody would want money. I mean, she just couldn't understand why you would want money, because she thought if you had land, you didn't need anything else, because you could provide for yourself and your family off of the land. But then you also had something to give to your children. You also had a legacy to pass on. And so her chapter really talks about the value of the landscape. She also talks a lot about folk culture, and one of the things that she was visited for by the students was planting by the signs. And so a lot of people enjoy reading about her explanation of planting by the signs of the zodiac, which is a system a lot of people still practice in rural areas, where you use the signs of the zodiac and the phases of the moon to tell you when to plant something, or even to do anything. You can dig a hole, cut your hair. If you do it on the wrong sign, you'll never get the dirt back into the hole. Your hair won't grow, things like that. So Margaret's a really interesting way to start the book. So then in a couple of chapters, as I mentioned, I tried to disperse them over decades. We encounter the story of Carrie Stewart. And I just have to ask, how old do you think this woman is? 70? Y'all thinking like 70-ish, maybe 80? She's 98. And during her second interview, I think she was about 103. So she lived a very long, very fruitful life. And I, doing this project, I have the privilege of being able to listen to the audio of these people, and that makes for just such a different experience in researching, to be able to feel like I'm sitting there because I get to listen to them. Now, Carrie, I will mention, she is featured in our podcast. It's a few seasons back, but if you go to our website and search for her name, you'll come across some audio from her, and I definitely recommend listening to her because she is sharp and witty and just enjoyable to listen to. But Carrie provides a very different experience than Margaret. They share a lot of similarities in terms of how they lived and how they grew up, but Carrie is the direct descendant of people who were enslaved in Franklin, North Carolina, which is about 30 minutes north of where Margaret would have lived. And so Carrie shares stories that were told to her by her grandparents and her parents about them being sold and about them working in slavery. Now, when people think about slavery in the South, they immediately tend to think of plantation slavery. And when you tell people that there was slavery in the mountains, they're usually like, that is not true. That didn't happen, but it did. It was very present in the mountains. It just took on a different shape because we're not by the coast, so we don't have large numbers of enslaved peoples coming in here. And we don't have huge farms, so a lot of people don't need a lot of hands. Most people would have maybe had a few people enslaved, unfortunately. But it did still happen, and so it's important for us to hear about these experiences, even if they are coming from generations down the road. But those oral histories within those own families are incredibly valuable, and it's an honor that they were passed on to Foxfire students so that we can share those stories and know more about the lives of those people who lived in the mountains. But Carrie herself, her own lived experience is so incredible. She, as you can maybe see in this quote, she thought she never worked. She claims to have never worked a day in her life. She raised 10 children, which in and of itself is an incredible amount of work, but she was also a midwife, and she was a midwife for decades, and she worked very hard in her classes to get her license, and she would go out any time of day, any time of night to deliver children from all families, not just in the Black community. And midwives played a really important role in mountain communities because medical care was and is still so hard to come by. And so it was important to have women in your community that you could call upon for help and create that support network so that you can assist each other in times of need. And so her story is really remarkable for many reasons, but I love this perspective that she provides on work, how she thought of herself, and yet we can look at this and say, no, this is a way that women do work, right? And so I just love her story. Nola Campbell was interviewed in the 1980s, and Nola Campbell actually grew up in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, so still in the Appalachia area. And Nola is very interesting because she is a Catawba Indian. We do have Cherokee women featured in this book, and a little bit more is known about the Cherokee, but most people aren't as familiar with the Catawba because they are so small. And the Catawba actually were able to stay in South Carolina during the Indian Removal Act because they had an agreement with the state of South Carolina where they had essentially purchased land that they could remain on. So a lot of the Catawba weren't removed, but their numbers, their tribal enrollment dwindled so much during that time that actually many of them went and stayed with Cherokee. And so Nola, as a potter, shows us how many of her techniques and her pottery forms kind of overlap with Cherokee and other indigenous peoples. But she talks mostly about her experience growing up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in South Carolina as a Native woman, as a Native child, how her family was treated because her father died when she was a young child, and how her family had to cope without having that man there to help them earn an income. So she actually had to leave school, and her family had to leave the reservation to go and work so that they could support themselves as sharecroppers. So providing a different, perspective on sharecropping, a different perspective on growing up in an Appalachian region as a child. And so she has just a really interesting story, and she's very vocal about different things, and you could just tell that she was a spitfire as a child. She has a few stories about getting into some trouble with her siblings. So there's a lot of humor in the stories that come out as you read through some of these more difficult passages about their experiences, and it's a really beautiful testament, I think, to the women's resilience, and something that they share in common is their ability to overcome these difficulties and to work their way through it. We have a few stories from immigrant women in our book as well, and one of them comes from Angelina Davis. And I put Angelina in the book because, again, when people stereotype Appalachia, they tend to think white, but they only tend to think of Scots-Irish descendants. And that can go for both men and women in Appalachia. But there are different cultural backgrounds that may present themselves the same, right? So Angelina is actually from Italy, and she's an immigrant from Italy who arrived here in the late 40s, early 50s. And her opinion and perspective of a small rural Georgia town at this time is just amazing. It's really interesting to read about because she grew up in Milan, which is a very large, very Catholic Italian city, very urban. And she meets her husband during World War II. They worked together, and she comes over basically as a war bride. And she arrives in Atlanta, and the first thing she noticed was the color of the clay, and she just couldn't get over the red dirt. And then they take this train, and then they take a car, and slowly, the roads get bumpier and bumpier until she arrives in Clayton, Georgia, which is in Rabun County. And she talks about how small everything was, and she's like, he told me it was a small town, but this is nothing. I mean, this is just nothing. There's nothing here. And she just kept waiting to see it, and it was just, there was nothing. She was just shocked. But I love the way she talks about her interactions with the people. And so she always says that everybody was so nice and so sweet. but she couldn't get over the food. I mean, every day, every place they went, it was fried chicken, gravy, mashed potatoes. And she says they just kept going to house after house to meet people, and that's all anybody was serving. And she like broke down, because she can't speak English. And so she talks to her husband, and he's saying, well, they're doing this special, like this is a special meal. And once she was able to make that connection, she was able to accept eating that much fried chicken a little bit better. But I love this story about the corn, because we take corn for granted and don't think about, well, these are some very significant cultural differences that, in Italy, it's animal feed. But she ended up playing a really pivotal role in getting a Catholic church established in our community by connecting with other immigrants to the area. There was a French woman who was the only other Catholic she knew of in the region. And today, the Catholic Church in town is still a legacy to the work that she did in her community. So this is also an important part of Foxfire, looking at the people who are helping shape what Appalachian culture is today. And so we have another immigrant story that talks a little bit about that as well. And in 2003, Foxfire students were fortunate enough to visit with Amanda Swimmer. For those of you who don't know, Amanda Swimmer is a beloved woman. She was a renowned Cherokee potter, and she was also very involved in the preservation of the Cherokee language. And so students went up there in the early 2000s to speak with her, mostly about her pottery, but as they are always wont to do in these interviews, the discussions about trade, craft, always open up to memories. And so Amanda takes students through her experiences growing up on the Qualla boundary in Cherokee, North Carolina. And Amanda's story opens us up to what life was like on Qualla before the park was established and after the park was established. And the creation of the Smokies, in some ways it just took land away from Native people and from settlers in the region, because it restricted access to the resources that they were used to having from the park. The park also introduced other species, and that influenced their experiences on Qualla, like elk. But more importantly, the park drastically changed the economy of Cherokee, and it makes it become a tourist economy. And what that tourist economy does is it shapes how people express and identify their Native culture. And Dakota Brown, who's featured later in this book, who's a young Cherokee woman, talks more in depth about this. But Amanda kind of sets the stage for that chapter by giving us her firsthand experiences of watching it happen. And so what people tend to do when we think of Native peoples is we tend to lump them in together into one definition of Indian. And we lose sight of the individual elements that distinguish those cultures from one another. So, for example, especially in Dakota's chapter, she talks about a practice of chiefing, where people would want to pull over if they saw an Indian and get a picture with somebody in a headdress. Well, headdresses are not traditional to Cherokee. They may wear them now, but they are not part of traditional Cherokee culture. And so this idea of chiefing is creating something that tourists want to see. And so how is what people are responding to tourism influencing their very own identity and their perception of their culture? And so Amanda shows us how this happens, and Dakota reflects on it later on. And it's really powerful, and it really makes you stop and think about your own perspectives of Indigenous culture and understanding how vibrant and active most Indigenous people still are, and making sure that we seek out resources from those people first rather than secondary sources. And then in the 20-teens, we had some students interview this woman right here, Ronda Reno. And Ronda is a self-identified granny or granny witch, which in her experience and her culture means that she is a healer. And so Ronda really speaks to stereotyping so much in her chapter, and how her own experience as a child growing up in the mountains with a grandmother and two strong aunts who were local healers, local midwives, even in the 60s, how that shaped her identity today, and how she tries to reclaim stereotypes and to re-educate people about what those terms actually mean and how she expresses them. She's also just a wonderful storyteller, and she weaves, again, like most of the women, hardship and humor together into a really powerful narrative. So this is just a collage of all of the women that are featured in the book. Again, they all have remarkable stories and each bring something to the table. And the book ends with a story from Kay Carver. They're actually out of order, apologize. But Kay really pulls it together well in talking about stereotypes. And I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from the end of her chapter. But Kay grew up with Foxfire because her father was interviewed when she was a child. He was a renowned moonshiner in Raven County. And then as a teenager, she participated in Foxfire. And then as an adult, she worked for Foxfire. And now she's served in different capacities on both our national board, our community board, and is now an advisory board member. So Kay was the perfect place to end the chapter because she grew up in a way that's very reminiscent of the earlier stories in the book, but she can see long term not just the impact of Foxfire, but what Appalachia means to her and to her community. So I'm just going to read this little excerpt from her chapter about stereotypes. So she says, I think you can stereotype any group of people if you choose to. I think it's a matter of choosing to meet people where they are and discovering who they are, not stereotyping. I think our identity is being swallowed up in the global world. I think very few people have that kind of identity anymore because we're such a global society. People don't tell me I sound like I've lived here all my life. I tell them, well, I've lived with a Yankee for 30-something years. You know, I can still say gone and ain't and all that stuff, but it's not like it was when I was growing up. We're very isolated. But there's no place like these mountains. I can be having an absolutely horrible day and just go sit down and look at the mountains and peace comes over me. My favorite thing is when I leave here, which I don't like to do, I come back and I top that hill in Hollywood, Georgia, and you see those mountains up in front of you. My whole body just relaxes. It just brings me such a sense of peace being here. It's a part of who I am. I think it's a combination of the sense of belonging to the community, of belonging to the land, of belonging to this place and time. And I think that's a sentiment that all of the women share. It was a hard task to put such different stories together because they all bring such diverse experiences, but in the end, they all relate to the landscape in a very similar way. They all speak about the landscape in kinship terms. They speak of it as they would of another person and the peace and security that this place specifically offers them. And that narrative becomes very apparent as you read through the book and pulls all of these, again, different narratives together. And if you're interested in learning more about Foxfire, we do have ways for you to come and experience the mountains and to engage in place and to experience these stories and to share your own. I omitted it from here on accident, but we do have a oral history project that we're running in conjunction with the book that you can visit on our website, which is www.foxfire.org. On the top, it says share your story, and we are looking for stories about women from women in Appalachia. And it's a crowdsourced oral history project, so you are welcome to record on your own. You don't have to be a woman to submit. And we're just looking to help people get engaged in having conversations in their community, because it's when we come together and share our stories and listen that we can really start building back stronger communities. So I highly recommend checking out our website. We've got a lot of great resources there as well. There's also opportunities for you to listen to some of these women. Our podcast is available on our website. Like I said, you can just search for some of the names or scroll through our podcast episodes. And we are very active on social media, if any of you are social mediers, and share a lot of images and little snippets of stories through social media as well. And if you guys ever have any questions, I'm happy to be available to you, and my email is up on the screen for you to reach out. But now I would love to turn it over to y'all and answer any questions or open it up for discussion. Yes, ma'am.
If they started in 1966 with the kids that were having some issues,
yeah.
how many of them are still around and participating?
I don't know the exact number, but we do have a lot of students who are still involved. So maybe not necessarily from that first class, but from several of the early classes, they're still either involved like virtually, or we have one person in particular who is actually a demonstrator at the museum. So he still comes up once a week. So it just depends, but most of them are still in the area. The whole Carver family, so Kay Carver Collins, who I mentioned, her dad was a moonshiner. She has 9 or 10 siblings, and the ones that are still alive are always still at Foxfire. So we do have a lot of good involvement from former students.
How fast is this way of life dwindling? Are the students having difficulties finding people to interview now?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because, you know, in many ways it's already gone. The people who are living like that in an authentic way. But there are people who want to start living that way again. And so there are people who are coming back who are trying to learn those skills or to blend them into, you know, a modern life. Because in many ways, like our society doesn't really allow for us to necessarily live in that much of a sustainable fashion anymore. But the kids are really interested in traditional skills, and as part of their summer program they are required to take a heritage skill where they apprentice with a demonstrator on a weekly basis to learn a traditional skill. And I put it in quotes because it's like their favorite part, and every year they ask me for more time to do their heritage skill. So we do see excitement and interest from students in traditional ways of life, and so again we just try to blend that into the program and help them understand that, you know, you can still do a lot of these traditional skills, and it's something even I have to learn too, and luckily the museum provides us with opportunities to be able to do that.
I've been down 441 many times, and that's just a gorgeous area.
It is.
2 questions, I guess. How far from like the Raven Gap School are you, and is there any connection with that?
We're maybe 10 minutes south of the school. We do have like working relationships with the school, but so Foxfire moved from Raven Gap to Rabun County in the 1970s when Raven Gap fully privatized. And then in 2017 or 2018, we actually took it out of the school system and converted it into a 7-week paid immersive leadership program. And that opportunity allowed us to open it to anybody in the county. So instead of it just being a journalism class at the high school, it was now back to being a hands-on immersive experience for any student in Rabun County. So we do have working relationships with all of the 3 schools in the county, but the program is housed now at the Foxfire Museum. Mm-hmm. Anything else?
And so in that immersive experience, are they mainly looking at things in the archives, or are they collecting additional data and interviews? Or
They are required to go out and do an interview. So we've created a project. We let the students name it, and they came up with the idea for SEED, Students Experiencing Education Differently. So it's their SEED project. So we put them in, or we let them identify small groups that have related topics of interest, and together they build a project that has an investigative component, a practicum component, and a service component. And so the investigative part of it requires that they conduct at least one interview with a professional or somebody related to that topic. Usually they do 2 or 3, and then they have to build some sort of project that has a contribution back to the museum. So we've had students do a lot of digital projects, like a documentary or a podcast, and we've had students do physical, like tactile projects, like build Cherokee weapons, build a boat. We had a couple of kids build a boat one year, which was pretty cool. And then sometimes some of them choose to just write traditional articles as well, research articles. And so those students might investigate in the archives, like the picture before they were researching about fishing, historic fishing techniques. I think it's fun. I hope they have fun. You never know with high school kids. Any other questions? Right, well, I am here available to sign books, but you're welcome to go to the shop and purchase one. I mean, I'm biased, but it is a pretty great book. There's some really remarkable stories in here, but no pressure. And I will be available for signing and questions. And thank you all so much for joining me today.